Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
It's a pleasure to be here with you. And I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting us to be here to speak with you and share what is unfolding on the African continent, particularly as it relates to the U.S. military presence, both historically and today. However, before I fully get into what I'd like to share, I'd like for us to take a minute to acknowledge the transition of our African freedom fighter, Winnie Mandela, who passed this week. She wasn't solely the wife of Nelson Mandela, but she was an activist and freedom fighter in her own right, fighting for the liberation of people in Azania, South Africa, and for the freedom and independence of Africans on the African continent. And we acknowledge her as she made her transition this past week. Interestingly, with Winnie Mandela, although she made a transition, she was a freedom fighter for peace, for justice, self-determination. That gave her the distinction of being placed on the U.S. terrorist list, like her husband, Nelson Mandela. What we've noticed, what we've observed, is that those who fight for freedom and liberation on the African continent, for self-determination, wind up being caught in the crosshairs of the United States, either being placed on the terrorist list, as in the case of Winnie Mandela, or being overthrown, as in the case of Patrice Lumumba, the Congo, in 1960, the Central Intelligence Agency overthrew Lumumba within a matter of weeks of his being elected to office and subsequently assassinated in 1961. Or in the case of the father of Pan-Africanism, Kwame Nkrumah, who was overthrown by the CIA in the late 1960s. So what we've seen is that the United States' presence and history on the African continent has been one to thwart the efforts of Africa's freedom fighters and liberation heroes, all in an effort to secure its strategic interests on the African continent. Strategic interests that are based in large part on controlling access to natural resources that are vital to the functioning of U.S. military industry. U.S. industries such as the aerospace industry, such as the technology industry or the electronics industry. So, when we see the Chinese, for example, increasing their economic presence on the African continent and establishing economic relations with a range of African countries, we find that the United States and Europe, incapable of competing on the economic front with the Chinese, then they go to what they know best and do best, and that is to bring their military presence to bear on other people's lands. And that's what we've seen under the Bush administration. They established AFRICOM, or Africa Command, in 2008. They told the American public in the propaganda that they're establishing this Africa Command in order to build wells, support humanitarian projects, benign efforts in order to assist Africans. And the truth of the matter is, there's a lot that Africa needs, but what is not on the top of that list of needs is increased U.S. military presence. Now, this Africa Command that was established by the Bush administration, it was picked up by Barack Obama. Within his first year of being in office, he increased U.S. military presence by 300%. After about a decade or so, U.S. military presence has increased almost 2,000%. So what we've seen is the hyper-militarization of the African continent. And that only came into many of our consciousness this past year in 2017, when 4 U.S. servicemen were killed in Niger. And it is that time that you had people saying, well, we didn't know the U.S. military was on the continent in that way. Well, that's not true. People did know, because one of the key examples of the U.S. militarization of the African continent was the bombing of Libya. The NATO-led intervention in Libya, that was at the forefront of it was the Africa Command. They were the one leading the bombing of Libya. And in a perverse form of blowback, those 4 U.S. soldiers that were killed in Niger can be tied to the U.S. bombing of Libya, because when the U.S. destroyed Muammar Gaddafi's government and destroyed the state, what happened? There was a flood of weapons that entered into the region, into Mali, Niger, Chad, and weapons wound up in the hands of terrorist groups that wound up killing U.S. soldiers. So we've seen the destructive nature of the U.S. militarization on the African continent. But probably the most insidious case, especially as it relates, and the most tragic case, especially as it relates to the loss of life, is the U.S. support through its military, its financing, its intelligence, and its training for client states, proxy states, states that carry out U.S. strategic interests where the United States back them and support them. And we've seen this in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, a country that has experienced the greatest loss of life as a result of conflict since the Holocaust, where an estimated 6 million Congolese have lost their lives since 1996 as a result of invasions backed by U.S. clients. Countries like Rwanda, led by Paul Kagame, countries like Uganda, led by Yoweri Museveni. The United States provided arms, training, financing, intelligence to those countries as they ravaged the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And when international bodies attempt to hold those countries accountable, the U.S. then runs political and diplomatic interference in an effort to cover for them. Not only do they do that, but they present these leaders who have blood on their hands, who have destroyed African lives. They present them to the world and actually call them the new breed of African leaders, Renaissance leaders. And they bring them here to the United States and they parade them around in the universities. They roll out the red carpet for them. And they go and they speak about matters of democracy and security, when in fact, back home in Africa, all they're doing is destroying democracy, spreading insecurity, breeding strife. And these are the kind of people that the U.S. government support on the African continent. They overthrow, assassinate, label as terrorists the freedom fighters, independence seekers like Winnie Mandela, Patrice Lumumba, Kwame Nkrumah, and then the killers who have blood on their hands like Paul Kagame, Yoweri Museveni. They shower them with military weapons, financing, arms, intelligence, the whole bit. So this is what we confront in our fight against U.S. militarization on the African continent, which has some 54 countries or so, and the U.S. has a military presence in almost all of them. They're in the process of building a $100 million drone base in Niger. It just last week came to light that they established an agreement with the Ghanaian government to increase their military presence in Ghana. and the Ghanaians have stood up and resisted. They're saying that we don't want the same experience here in Ghana that the people in Okinawa are having to suffer with their women being raped, people being run over by tanks in the streets, and no recourse for justice or accountability. So we call on you here today, and those who can hear our voice, to stand with us in resisting the militarization of the African continent, in exposing what the true nature is of the U.S. military presence, protecting its strategic interests as they pursue key minerals that are vital to the military industry, vital to the aerospace industry, minerals such as cobalt, which the Democratic Republic of Congo has the largest reserves in the world. Cobalt is a key mineral that's critical to the aerospace industry, critical to the military industry. And for us who as consumers, those who are engaged or support of green energy, the electric cars that we drive, the Prius and the Tesla, they need that cobalt from the Congo. And as they extract those resources for us to benefit from our electronic devices and our technology tools, we have children who are suffering in the mines, digging out by hand and using sticks to get that out, get the cobalt and other minerals out to the global community. So this militarization, this increased U.S. presence has brought nothing but increased suffering for people of Africa. Have brought nothing but devastation for people in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And that's the message I bring to you here today, that each and every one of you can play a role in resisting AFRICOM, in resisting the U.S. militarization, in joining the people of Ghana who stood up last week, in joining the people of Burkina Faso who stood up to drive out a puppet of the West in Blaise Compaoré, joining the people of Togo who are standing up to fight for justice and getting rid of these strongmen and dictators that are imposed on African people by the United States, by the French, by the Europeans. And in order for you to do that, you can visit our website. One key website I recommend that, or two key websites I recommend that you consult in order for you to be engaged and support the resistance movement on the African continent. You want to go to Telema, T-E-L-E-M-A, telema.org. That's T-E-L-E-M-A. A second site that you should visit is Black Alliance for Peace, blackallianceforpeace.com. And we encourage you to join us in our fight as we pursue peace on the African continent, as we pursue justice, and as we strive for human dignity. Thank you very much.